Well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll be your host today, and thank you first of all to our session sponsor, CPA British Columbia. My name is Dan Hurley. I am a director and chair-elect of the Vancouver Island Economic Alliance. I'm also principal of the Hurley Martin Group, a new public relations and community engagement partnership focused on consulting and training. We want to welcome those who are live, who live and on the Coast Salish, Nuchalot, and Kwakiutl peoples, the traditional territories of these Indigenous peoples. And today I'm speaking to you from Snuneymuxw territory on Gabriola Island. Everyone, just a reminder, a few notes about Zoom. Everyone except the presenter and myself, please keep your mute on. With so many people participating from across our region today, we want to make sure we're focused on our presenter and not hearing too much background noise. Also a reminder for those who have questions or comments, there is a chat button located usually at the bottom of your screen. This is the place where you can write in your questions while the presentation is ongoing and after when we have questions and answers. So please take a look at the bottom of your screen. It should be a flashing orange light when there are chats already starting. So we appreciate everyone for joining us today. VIEA's mission is to be a driving force for a vibrant and diverse island and Gulf Island economy. Two of our primary objectives are to unite and connect decision makers and to inform and add to the conversation around economic and social vitality. VIEA's goal is hosting these video events is to bring us all together in common cause during this challenging time for all of us, to support each other now and to work collectively to prepare for the next step. We're hearing all kinds of major announcements on a daily basis and receiving pages and pages of information by email, social media, and other sources. So this series is about helping to distill that information, make it meaningful, and to make these actionable steps relevant to you and your organizations. So before I introduce our presenter, a few details. So like I said, we're getting used to this Zoom technology. This is now our third presentation that we've held. So we're learning as we go, but do forgive us if as we still make our way through this technology. I want to give a special thanks to Jennifer Huffnagel of Innovation Island for helping us and working with us to get used to this new way of connecting. With lots of online traffic and all of us in isolation, we may experience some momentary disruptions due to our Wi-Fi or what have you, so please bear with us. So following the presentation, we're gonna hear from our presenter for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have up to 15 minutes of questions and answers afterwards. So to ask your question, once again, use the chat box on your bar. It will likely be found at the bottom of your screen, and write your questions in there. So simply open it up and type your questions, and I will be looking for them, curating them, and then I will be asking those directly of our presenter. So today our speaker is Sheridan King. She is a barrister and solicitor with the firm Ramsey, Lamp and Rhodes in Nanaimo, and she will speak about the legalities of human resource decisions for employers during this period. So at this time, I'm going to hand the virtual floor, over to Sheridan.
Good morning. My name is Sheridan King, and I am a lawyer with RLR Law here in Nanaimo. I have an employment law practice. I handle employment litigation matters for both employers and employees. I prepare employment contracts and workplace policies. I've also recently completed a certificate in conducting workplace investigations, so I really look forward to doing that work as well. Thank you for having me here today. The topic I'm going to be focusing on today is temporary layoffs and how you as employers can try to avoid the pitfalls with temporary layoffs in light of COVID-19. I'm going to start with some background principles, so basically some boring definitions, and then we'll move on to the practical suggestions for how you can approach a layoff. So your first point of reference is going to be the Employment Standards Act, and it defines a temporary layoff as one of two things: either in the case of where there's a right of recall for the employee, a layoff that exceeds the period that they're allowed to be recalled, or in any other case, a layoff of up to 13 weeks in any period of 20 consecutive weeks. If you don't really deal with a right of recall, then you likely don't have one in your employment contracts. But today's primarily going to focus on the second point, being the 13-week period within 20 consecutive weeks. So if you lay off an employee and they're not recalled to employment within those 13 weeks or at the completion of those 13 weeks, then they're deemed to have been terminated as at the beginning of the layoff. And in British Columbia, there is no automatic right of layoff. While the ESA provides for it, that's more so sets the parameters for if you have that right in your employment contract. So the only way that you can actually do a temporary layoff in BC is if it's expressly provided for in a written contract, if the employee consents to it, or in certain seasonal industries where the layoffs are going to be expected. If an employer does decide to proceed with a layoff without a contract allowing them to do so, then the risk is of a claim by the employee for constructive dismissal. And constructive dismissal is a unilateral change in a material term of employment, such as reducing pay or reducing hours, either without adequate notice to the employee or without the employee's consent. It's a claim that's defined as the employer's evincing an intention to no longer be bound by the employment agreement. So if an employee is constructively dismissed, then severance obligations arise. If you don't have a contract, then employees are entitled to both notice as set out in the Employment Standards Act, as well as common law reasonable notice. So the calculation of common law reasonable notice looks at 4 factors. It looks at the age of the employee, the length of service, their job description, and the availability of similar employment. There's a rough baseline that exists for managerial employees, and it says that they are entitled to approximately 1 month of notice per year of service. The factors I just mentioned operate to give a range. It's an inexact science as to how much an employee in each particular circumstance would be entitled to. Therefore, if you proceed to lay off an employee without a contractual right to do so, and they don't consent, and they take the view that they've been constructively dismissed, then their entitlement is not only the entitlement under the Employment Standards Act, it could mean an expensive severance package is owed to the employee. All of the concepts that I've just discussed are not exhaustive. Some of them could apply and some of them could not, but there's additional concepts which could apply, which we don't really have time to discuss in these brief 10 minutes that I've got, but they are matters such as human rights in relation to who you might consider laying off. I can foresee an example where perhaps you keep only a few key employees, but the employees that you keep may only be men. That may be completely unintentional, but you may want to stave off any claims for human rights breaches. There's also some discussion about whether or not, in light of the virus, you could argue that the contract of employment is frustrated. But in the interest of time, I think I should probably move on to the practical solutions and how you could protect yourself if you are considering proceeding for a layoff. Before I move on to the suggestions in approaching a layoff, I'm going to make a quick plug for alternatives to layoff. The first point would be to reasonably consider whether or not your employees can do productive work from home. Try that first. If that's not going to work, then ask the employees whether or not they could use their vacation time first. And then if that vacation time doesn't cover off enough time, because we have no idea how long this is going to go on, hopefully not too much longer, but we don't know. If it's not enough time, then at the end of using that vacation time, then they could proceed with a temporary layoff at that point in time. You could try wage reductions or a reduced work week. If you go for too much of a reduction, then you may run into the same constructive dismissal issue that we've just discussed, but a small reduction across perhaps a larger workforce may allow you to make ends meet during this time. The other option is going to be rotating layoffs. So you wouldn't have every single employee laid off at the same time, but those are some creative suggestions that may help you avoid it. But if you must proceed with a layoff, what can you do to reduce your risk for a claim of constructive dismissal? Just as a practice point, you may want to keep your business justification for the layoff prepared and amass the documents and keep them safe, just in case an employee decided to make a claim for constructive dismissal or decided to make a human rights complaint by virtue of who got laid off and who didn't. You have those business justifications ready and prepared. How you approach your employees or employee for a layoff is going to be important, because if you don't have that right, you need to get their consent to the temporary layoff. So we would strongly suggest a we're all in this together approach and try to get a buy-in from them. And you can be honest about the impact that the pandemic is having on your business. We would suggest that when you approach an employee for a layoff, that you prepare a letter to the employee explaining the need for the layoff and tie it directly to COVID-19. If it's a government-ordered shutdown, say so. At minimum, tie it directly to the pandemic. You should also outline your intention to recall the employee, and the strongest way would be to set a timeline on when you intend to recall them, but in these circumstances, you should probably build in some flexibility that as the situation evolves, that may need to change, and making that known in the letter that you do intend to recall them, but we can be uncertain as to when that would happen. If you can, we suggest that you keep your employees on any benefit packages that they already have. This is one way to provide them some comfort that at least during the period of layoff that they have coverage. Some of them have families, and that may help them buy into the concept of a temporary layoff. You will probably want to contact your benefits plan provider in order to ensure that what you're offering the employee is actually allowable under your policy. Some policies may require that you have a certain amount of people engaged in active employment for a certain amount of time. So I would check with your benefits plan provider. In sum, the issue relating to constructive dismissal means that it's likely better that the employee accepts a temporary layoff rather than take the view that they have been constructively dismissed, because if they take the view that they've been constructively dismissed, that's bringing about an end to their employment relationship with you. You pay severance, you're under no obligation to hire them back ever again. And while they may get some severance now and may carry them through into the future, depending on how long that employee's worked for you in their position, it may not be enough to get them through the rest of this pandemic. And most employees would like to take the view that they will have employment once things start to get back to normal. So I strongly encourage everyone to get independent legal advice and to see if any of the concepts or solutions above might apply to your unique situation. Every employment practice and every employer's business is unique, and you want to make sure that you're tailoring your choices to what would be appropriate for your own workplaces. I believe that's my 10 minutes, so I will pass it back over to Dan and move on to some questions.
Thanks so much, Sheridan. Very informative. The first question I have actually just goes back to your first point about the 13-week period. And maybe you sort of alluded to that these are extraordinary times. But if indeed we're on a case where by early July, which would take us to about 13 weeks, so if a company is already, or a firm has already had to lay off employees in the past 2 weeks, and we are still in some form of shutdown by that point, what would be the likely approach by either government or other regulatory bodies in that case?
I can't speak for what the likely approach would be as to what they're going to do. I know that amendments to the the Employment Standards Act have recently come out, which allow for layoffs in certain circumstances and different types of job protected leaves. Now, from the employer's perspective, if we're not back to work and our government does take the view that you have or you can't exceed the temporary layoff, or we're not back to normal in 13 weeks, then I think the argument becomes stronger that perhaps the employment contract has been frustrated. And if an employment contract is frustrated, the concept of frustration means that through no fault of anyone's, the employment the contract is impossible to be performed. It's kind of like when you rent an apartment and the condo building burns down before you can take occupancy. It's impossible to be performed. But whether or not those frustration arguments are going to be successful is an unknown right now.
Yeah. Just a reminder to people with questions, when you go to the chat box, you have the ability to send me a message. So I encourage you when you go there that you address your questions to me, and then I will read them to Sheridan. And we have a question here from Nancy Arsenault. What are the recommendations between furloughing an employee versus layoff, given the upcoming government programs? So thinking of the emergency benefit, the wage subsidy, and a variety of other government programs. What would be the recommendations?
So your recommendation, just so I can make sure that I've got the question, your question is layoffs in contrast to the other job protected leaves that are presently being provided for by our government?
Yes, I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that because each of them have their own set of standards which apply, I know that under the Employment Standards Act, there's a certain amount of leave for either caring for other family members, or if you yourself are quarantined, those types of leaves, I think you could probably exhaust all of those other leaves before you would consider laying off the employee, and see if there's literally any other alternative to leaves or layoffs for your employees before you proceed with the layoff. Because the layoff, once it starts, as of right now, you've got 13 weeks. So if you can figure out any other type of benefit for that employee before you proceed with that, I'd highly recommend you do that.
Okay. Nancy commented back while you were speaking. She said, yes, if revenue has stopped, what is the best course of action? In tourism, we are kind of frozen.
If revenue has stopped.
Revenue has stopped, yeah.
Yeah, then you may have no other alternative than to lay off your employees. You can be creative in, if you keep anyone on, then you can try and see if you can get their agreement to defer wages and say, look, once we start back up, we'll owe you the back pay. That's an option. And see if you can get buy-in from them on that idea. But until then, this is where approaching them with the honesty that our income has entirely suspended. And in light of that, we have to proceed with a layoff in this circumstance.
Okay, our next question is from Shelley Crest. My question is whether by requiring employees to take vacation time, just one second here. By requiring employees to take vacation time as an alternative to a layoff, is there not a risk of the employee arguing a constructive dismissal? For example, by effectively being forced to take vacation for non-vacation purposes?
I think that argument would be, I think there's a low chance of success in that argument. You as the employer generally have the ability to determine when an employee takes their vacation. You have the right for business purposes to figure out when an employee is in or out of the office, for example, and you have a legitimate business reason for needing a certain number of employees at your office at a certain number of times. So I think that you could still see if you can get their buy-in on using their vacation. If they don't want to use their vacation, then the only other alternative would appear to be the layoff issue. And then if they're recalled, great, they retain that vacation. If they're not recalled, then that vacation would be forming part of the severance entitlement.
Okay, our next question is from Greg Phillips. Instead of laying off, might it be easier for everyone to just terminate without cause and provide pay in lieu of notice?
The concept of a layoff gives you that breathing room, and because a termination without notice, the math is essentially the same as a constructive dismissal. It's just a circuitous way of getting there. You're not approaching the employee and terminating them. You are trying to lay them off, and they're taking the view that they've been constructively dismissed. So the entire concept of a layoff saves you from that severance obligation in the interim while you get your feet under your business and figure out, are you going to be able to survive this and what you're going to look like economically when everyone returns to work, which will hopefully be soon.
Okay, our next question is from Butterworth.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dan, I can't hear you. I didn't hear the question. I'm sorry, Dan.
Okay, sorry about that. I had a little internet disruption there. If a business has to close due to COVID-19 and money is not coming in, how would a business keep their employees?
So the business is closed. Is it closed temporarily, or are you shutting down operations? Because if it's closed temporarily and you're trying to keep your employees, then the way that you keep them is and there's no money coming in, is trying to figure out some of these creative alternatives. Maybe you do a wage deferral agreement, but I think the only way that you keep them is to lay them off and pay for their benefits. I mean, it's always open to employers to do wage top-ups on top of EI if you can do that. But if you're closed, then your options are very limited. And so the question is who's closing the business? Is it a government mandated shutdown, or is it, by virtue of lack of business, you're closing your doors? Because if it's government mandated, that's a stronger argument in favor of frustration of the contract. But if you frustrate the contract, then the employment relationship's over. But if you're following public health recommendations, then your options are essentially to lay them off and hope that they accept the recall if and when it happens within that 13 weeks. There is also the concept of an employee's obligation to mitigate their damages. So if they are temporarily laid off and you offer them reemployment, and they don't accept that when they come back, then that's a factor which would count against them, because they have an obligation to mitigate their damages. So if they made a claim for constructive dismissal, them not taking that offer of reemployment could reduce the amount of damages that they'd be entitled to if they decided to proceed with a claim for constructive dismissal.
Okay, we've got lots of questions here, so I'll try to get to as many as we can. I know we have about 8 minutes left. I think in that last case, the individual was referring to a temporary closure. So I think you perhaps answered that question here. Okay, I'm just going to scroll back up here. Next question is, if businesses have made layoffs already and they are on EI, so if an employee has already started collecting EI, can an employer bring them back on the new 75% wage subsidy, and who pays back the EI? Not sure if you're able to answer that question, as this is a fairly new program.
Yeah, it's a fairly new program. I think the applications for that are only being rolled out tomorrow. And so I presume that tomorrow there will be publications about your ability to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent question. I think we all have those questions, but I think we'll work on getting some of those answers by next week once that information is rolled out. Everything's moving at the speed of light these days. Okay, next question is, if an employee wants to reduce work hours by choice, but not lay off employees, how does the work sharing program work with the federal government? Are you familiar with that arrangement?
I'm not familiar with that arrangement. I do think that you have to get approval to do it. But I can't talk about the intricacies of applying for that agreement.
Okay. Next question from Allison Fuhr. What would happen if an employee refuses to sign a temporary layoff, will not accept the layoff, nor sign a letter, but they are not saying it's constructive dismissal?
It's interesting. I don't know how they could take both positions, because one means the other. It will be up to the employee whether or not they want to take the view that they've been constructively dismissed. If then you have to proceed with the layoff, even though they won't sign it. Your business will be probably temporarily closed, so they will have nowhere to show up. But at the end of it, then they can take the view that they've been constructively dismissed and try to file a claim for that. But if they decide not to pursue that, then you do everything you can. You've tried to get their buy-in, and it's a calculated risk to proceed with the layoff, knowing that they may full well take the view later on that they've been constructively dismissed.
Okay, our next question is, If an employee can't work from home and has a high-risk family member at home, can they get EI if they opt to stay home to protect their family members?
I believe there is a protected leave for that under the Employment Standards Act. It's not within the scope of what I was going to talk about today, but I believe that there is protection under the Employment Standards Act, and it may be one of those specific COVID-19 leaves that are available.
Okay. This next question is from Omar. I signed a part-time contract that was leading to a full-time permanent job. 2 days after the employer emailed me about suspending their operations. Can I apply for EI? I hold a work permit.
I believe in order to apply for EI, you've had to have had a certain number of insurable hours per year. So he may be limited in his ability to do that. And if he just signed a temporary contract, my concern would be whether or not he's within a probationary period and whether or not the employer is obligated to him in any way for any severance. But that sounds like a very specific issue. And so I would suggest that he contact a lawyer, see if someone can help him.
Are you able to hear me?
Oh, now I can.
Okay, good. All right. I'm going to ask a couple of more questions here. If you lay off during this situation, do you need to reinstate when business is back to normal? You can, yeah. So if you are you able? Do you have to reinstate somebody after you're back to normal operations?
You don't necessarily have to reinstate someone after you've temporarily laid them off. So as you approach the end of the temporary layoff period, you can make the election to proceed with a without cause termination, at which point in time severance obligations would be owed to the employee.
Just in terms of some of the measures that have been announced that you've described, are they similar to federal?
I'm sorry, Dan, I've lost you again.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Did you hear my last question?
I did not.
Okay, sorry. We'll make this the last one because I think we're almost out of time. Are the measures you've described similar for federally regulated employers?
The measures as far as the alternative EI options, I believe that is like EI is federally regulated, so I would assume that would apply if you're laid off. But if you're a federally regulated employee, then you're under likely the federal labor code. And so the contractual principles that I've talked about in relation to the risk of constructive dismissal when you reduce somebody's hours or you change their pay is going to be the same. But you'd have to look at that individual employer's position and find out whether or not there's a different requirement for them. The focus of today was about the BC Employment Standards Act, so it would likely be a little bit different, but employment law principles are generally uniform across the country with a couple of exceptions here and there.
Okay, two last quick questions here. If schools are not reopened, are teachers and support staff who are laid off entitled to severance?
Teachers and support staff, I believe, are unionized employees, which are likely covered under a collective agreement. So you'd have to refer to your collective agreement and your union representation to find out what your entitlement would be in those circumstances.
Okay. And the final piece here, what about employee portion of benefits if laid off and benefits continue?
If you can pay it, do it. You can also clarify who's going to be paying for what when you lay them off. So if the employee has a certain portion of their benefits and they'd like to keep that going, then you can either defer their payment or that portion of it if and when you recall them. There's a lot of creative ways that you can handle these small interim amounts. And if your business can afford it, because likely if they're not getting the paycheck, then they may not be able to contribute that amount because EI, as we know, does not quite cover everything that we need it to.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Sheridan. This has been very helpful in a short period of time. Lots of questions. I'm sure there's more questions to be asked, but we have some more sessions coming up. So thanks so much for your time today. We want to make sure that everyone who's watching here today, if you haven't signed up for our e-news, please do so. You can do that off of our VIEA.ca website. We expect to continue to offer these sessions probably twice a week. And indeed, our next session is taking place this Friday, April 3rd at 11:30.
I think Dan is frozen again. Essentially what he was going to say is the next session is on Friday. Dan, are you there? Are you back?
Yep. Oh,
We've lost you for the whole time.
Okay.
You're back now.
Okay. All right. I will say this again. So thanks so much, Sheridan, for your time today. I want to make sure that everyone knows about our video sessions. So if you haven't signed up for our e-news, please do so off of the VIEA.ca webpage. Our next session is taking place this Friday at 11:30, and our speaker will be Mike Delves of MNP, and he will be speaking about the temporary wage subsidy. We had a lot of questions about that today, so please join us on Friday to get more information. Next Tuesday, we will have Katie Bishop of TD Canada Trust. She is also a board member with VIEA, and she'll be able to provide more details on how to manage loans and mortgage payments during this time. And we have other topics planned. And if you have ideas for topics, or maybe you would like to be a speaker, please contact us through George Hansen at george@viea.ca to provide some information. So thanks so much. And a final point, these recordings are available to watch again. They will be available at the VIEA.ca website webpage in the next day or two. And please share this with others as well. This is a really important time for us to be connected and to make sure that we keep company during this period.
I think Dan got frozen again, but before we sign off, I just wanted to say thank you for having me.